Eleanor adjusted her pearl necklace in the gilded mirror of their elegant home. A mid-century masterpiece Victor had restored with meticulous care. She could hear the faint clink of glassware as he prepared their anniversary dinner, a ritual he never missed in their 10 years of marriage. To everyone outside, they were the perfect couple. Eleanor's career as a psychologist specializing in couple therapy flourished, and Victor's art dealership brought them into the orbit of elite society. Victor's dedication was both charming and oppressive. His love came in grand gestures. Trips to Venice, rare art pieces gifted to mark milestones, and endless attention to Eleanor's needs. Yet, beneath her grateful smile, she harbored a secret dissatisfaction. His devotion felt stifling, predictable, and her carefully curated life began to feel more like a gilded cage. As Victor called her to the dining room, Eleanor brushed off the gnawing restlessness. The table was set with fine china, soft candlelight dancing on Victor's sharp features as he poured champagne. He was attentive, his conversation vibrant with stories from the art world. Eleanor laughed at his anecdotes, feeling the weight of his love. A love that no longer ignited her, but instead tethered her to the expectations of their perfect life. The evening ended as it always did. Victor pulled her into his arms, whispering sweet nothings as they danced to a record spinning softly in the background. She allowed herself to sink into his embrace, but her mind wandered elsewhere. She couldn't yet name the feeling or the spark missing in her life. But soon, an uninvited ghost from Victor's past would arrive to redefine everything Eleanor thought she wanted. The knock at the door was sharp and unexpected, echoing through the stillness of the evening. Victor glanced at Eleanor, his brow furrowing in curiosity. They weren't expecting anyone. As he opened the door, a woman stepped into the light. A striking figure with sharp cheekbones, raven black hair, and an air of effortless confidence. Her dark eyes locked onto Victor's, and the silence between them was electric. "Charlotte," Victor breathed, his voice a mix of surprise and tension. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, her glass of champagne hovering mid-air. She had heard of Charlotte in fleeting, guarded comments Victor had made over the years. His estranged younger sister had vanished from his life nearly a decade ago, a fallout he had never fully explained. "Miss me?" Charlotte's lips curled into a smirk, but her gaze flicked briefly to Eleanor, appraising her. Victor hesitated, his usual composure faltering. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte shrugged nonchalantly, stepping into the house as if she had every right to be there. "Let's just say I'm back in town and thought it was time for a family reunion." Eleanor, always the gracious host, stepped forward to defuse the tension. "You must be Charlotte. Victor's told me about you. Please, come in." Charlotte turned her attention to Eleanor, her smile widening. "I hope he's only told you the good things." Victor's jaw tightened. "This isn't a good time, Charlotte. Is it ever?" Charlotte replied smoothly, brushing past him into the living room. "Relax, Victor. I won't stay long." But as Charlotte settled into their space with an unnerving familiarity, Eleanor couldn't help but feel drawn to her. There was an undeniable magnetism to Charlotte, a dangerous edge that stood in stark contrast to Victor's safe, predictable nature. As the evening wore on, Victor remained guarded, his discomfort evident in his terse responses. But Charlotte's charm was disarming, and Eleanor found herself captivated by the stories of her travels, her wit, and the way she seemed to hold power in every room she entered. When Charlotte finally left, Victor shut the door with a sharp exhale, his hands gripping the frame. "She's trouble, Eleanor. Don't let her fool you." But Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of Charlotte's piercing gaze and the thrill it had sent through her. Trouble, perhaps, was exactly what she had been craving. In the days following Charlotte's unexpected visit, Eleanor found herself preoccupied with thoughts of her. Charlotte's presence had been electric, and the memory of her smirk lingered in Eleanor's mind like a forbidden melody. It wasn't just her beauty or confidence. It was the way she seemed to unravel the careful order of their lives with effortless charm. Victor, on the other hand, grew increasingly tense. He avoided speaking about Charlotte, brushing off Eleanor's questions with curt remarks. "She's unpredictable," he said one evening, pacing the living room. "She always has an agenda. Stay clear of her." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. Charlotte had shared glimpses of her life during their brief encounter. Wild adventures, untamed passions, and a freedom Eleanor hadn't dared to dream of. She began to wonder, what had driven them apart? Why was Victor so guarded about his sister? One afternoon, while Victor was away at work, Eleanor received an unexpected message on her phone. It was from Charlotte. The text was short but tantalizing.
There.
3 p.m. You know the place. Don't tell Victor. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she stared at the screen. She knew the cafe Charlotte meant. It was one Victor often spoke of from his childhood. Despite her better judgment, Eleanor felt a thrill at the secrecy. At 3 p.m., she found herself sitting across from Charlotte at a small, intimate table tucked in the corner of the cafe. Charlotte was radiant, her dark hair swept to one side, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "You came," Charlotte said, leaning back in her chair. "I wasn't sure you'd dare." Eleanor laughed nervously. "Victor doesn't like surprises. He didn't seem happy about your visit." Charlotte's expression darkened slightly. "Victor doesn't like anything he can't control. He always needed everything to be perfect, even when we were kids. I'm guessing you know what that's like." Eleanor hesitated but nodded. "He does have a strong sense of order." Charlotte leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "And where do you fit in all of that, Eleanor? Are you his partner? Or just another piece in his perfect little puzzle?" The question struck a nerve, and Eleanor felt herself blushing. Charlotte's words were bold, intrusive, but they held a truth Eleanor couldn't ignore. She realized she hadn't felt truly seen in years, until now. The conversation drifted into lighter topics, but the tension remained. Charlotte's energy was intoxicating, and when they parted, she placed a hand lightly on Eleanor's arm. "Don't let him cage you, Eleanor," she said softly. "You're more than his picture-perfect wife." Eleanor walked home with her heart racing, her thoughts in turmoil. For the first time, she saw her life through a different lens, and Charlotte was the one holding it. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to Charlotte. Their secret meetings became a regular occurrence. Coffee dates, long walks through the city, and stolen hours in quiet corners. Eleanor told herself it was harmless. Charlotte was magnetic, a burst of chaos that made her feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. Victor, oblivious to their growing bond, had thrown himself into his work, preparing for an upcoming gallery showcase. The distance between him and Eleanor widened, and she found solace in Charlotte's vibrant presence. One evening, Charlotte invited Eleanor to her apartment. It was a small but stylish space, filled with eclectic art and an air of unapologetic individuality. Eleanor felt out of place yet intrigued, like a tourist in a world she secretly longed to inhabit. Charlotte handed Eleanor a glass of wine and gestured for her to sit. "So," she said, curling up on the couch beside her, "what's it like being Victor's perfect wife?" Eleanor laughed nervously, swirling her wine. "It's predictable. Comfortable, I suppose." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Comfortable sounds like a synonym for boring." Eleanor didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. Charlotte leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You deserve more, Eleanor. Don't you ever crave something unexpected?" Eleanor's breath hitched as Charlotte's fingers brushed hers. The air between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Eleanor felt her heart racing, a war raging within her. She knew she should leave, but she couldn't move. Charlotte's presence was intoxicating, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly seen. Charlotte tilted her head, studying Eleanor's expression. "You don't have to answer," she said softly, "but I think I already know." Before Eleanor could process what was happening, Charlotte leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, a question rather than a demand. Eleanor froze, her mind screaming at her to stop, but her body betrayed her. She kissed Charlotte back, the thrill of the forbidden sending a shiver down her spine. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor's face burned with guilt and exhilaration. This is wrong, she stammered, standing abruptly. Charlotte remained calm, her gaze steady. Wrong according to whom? Victor? Society? Or is it just wrong because it feels so right? Eleanor couldn't respond. She grabbed her coat and fled. The memory of the kiss seared into her mind. As she walked home, the guilt gnawed at her. But so did the undeniable spark she hadn't felt in years. Eleanor spent the next few days in turmoil. She avoided Victor, feigning a cold to explain her distant demeanor. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Charlotte's lips against hers, the rush of adrenaline that had overtaken her. She tried to convince herself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but the truth was harder to deny. She wanted more. Charlotte, on the other hand, was unapologetic. She sent Eleanor cryptic messages. Thinking of you. Missed our talks. You felt it too, didn't you? Eleanor deleted each message immediately, but not before rereading them several times. She hated how they made her feel. Excited, alive, desired. It was a stark contrast to the routine safety of her life with Victor. Victor, engrossed in the gallery's upcoming showcase, failed to notice Eleanor's internal struggle. He was distracted, throwing himself into work with his usual intensity. When he did talk to her, it was about logistics, seating arrangements, catering, guest lists. Their conversations felt transactional, void of intimacy. One evening, as Victor worked late, Eleanor found herself unable to resist. She texted Charlotte, "I can't stop thinking about that night." The reply was instant, "Come over." Against her better judgment, Eleanor found herself outside Charlotte's apartment once again. The moment the door opened, Charlotte pulled her inside, her hands lingering on Eleanor's waist. "No running this time," Charlotte said, her voice low and teasing. Eleanor didn't protest. That night, their connection deepened, and the boundaries Eleanor had clung to dissolved entirely. It wasn't just the thrill of the forbidden. It was the way Charlotte made her feel seen, understood, and alive in a way Victor never had. But as Eleanor lay beside Charlotte, the weight of her choices began to press down on her. She couldn't shake the image of Victor's face if he ever found out. She tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, a storm brewing on the horizon. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Charlotte had her own agenda. While she kissed Eleanor and whispered promises, a glint of something darker flickered in her eyes. Something calculated. This wasn't just about passion. For Charlotte, it was about power and revenge. Eleanor was simply the pawn. And soon, Victor would find himself caught in the web Charlotte was so carefully spinning. Eleanor returned home late that night, her heart pounding as she slipped quietly through the front door. Victor was still awake, sitting in the dimly lit living room with a glass of whiskey in hand. His brow furrowed as he looked up at her. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of suspicion. Eleanor hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. "Out with a friend," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just catching up." Victor studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "You've been distant lately," he said. "Is everything okay?" Eleanor's stomach twisted with guilt. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm just tired, Victor. Work has been overwhelming." He nodded, though his expression didn't soften. "Let me know if there's anything I can do." Eleanor excused herself, retreating to the sanctuary of their bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. The guilt was unbearable, but so was the thought of ending things with Charlotte. Her world had become a tightrope walk, and every step felt more precarious than the last. The next day, Victor surprised her with tickets to a weekend retreat in the countryside, a getaway meant to reconnect them. Eleanor plastered on a grateful smile, but the thought of being alone with Victor for 2 days filled her with dread. She didn't know how to navigate the growing chasm between them while keeping her secret intact. Later that evening, Charlotte's name lit up Eleanor's phone. The message was simple but loaded with meaning. "Tell him you're busy. Come to me instead." Eleanor's chest tightened. Charlotte was bold, relentless, and utterly irresistible. But this time, Eleanor knew she couldn't just disappear without raising Victor's suspicions. She replied, "I can't. He'll notice." Charlotte's reply came quickly. "Let him notice. Isn't that part of the fun?" Eleanor stared at the screen, torn between the life she had built with Victor and the intoxicating pull of Charlotte. But before she could respond, Victor walked into the room, his presence snapping her back to reality. She hastily locked her phone and forced a smile. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes lingering on her. "Of course," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. But Victor wasn't fooled. As he walked away, his jaw tightened. He knew something was off, and he was determined to find out what. In the shadows of their seemingly perfect life, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would soon shatter everything. The weekend retreat was supposed to be peaceful, but the tension between Victor and Eleanor was palpable. Victor tried to engage her. Long walks through the countryside, candlelit dinners, and quiet moments by the fire. But Eleanor's mind was elsewhere. She smiled and nodded, but her responses were hollow, her thoughts consumed by Charlotte. Victor, ever perceptive, took note of her distracted behavior. He began to watch her more closely, searching for answers in the subtle changes he'd been noticing. The late nights, the secretive phone use, the distant look in her eyes. On the second evening of the retreat, Eleanor excused herself early, claiming exhaustion. Victor remained in the living room, sipping his wine and staring into the fire. But as the minutes passed, unease gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. He climbed the stairs quietly, pushing open the bedroom door. Eleanor was sitting on the bed, her back to him, her phone glowing in her hands. She didn't hear him enter. Victor watched as she typed furiously, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Eleanor jumped, nearly dropping her phone. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of guilt and panic. "Oh, just a friend from work," she stammered, quickly locking the screen. Victor's eyes narrowed. "At this hour?" She forced a laugh, trying to appear nonchalant. "We're coordinating schedules for next week." "It's nothing." Victor didn't press further, but doubt gnawed at him. The following morning, while Eleanor was in the shower, he picked up her phone. He felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't like him, but his instincts screamed that something was wrong. The messages he found were vague, but they told him enough. "Charlotte, I miss you. Last night was perfect." "Eleanor, I wish I could see you again today." Victor's heart sank as he scrolled through the conversation. The messages were coded, avoiding explicit details, but the intimacy between Eleanor and Charlotte was undeniable. His hands shook as he put the phone back where he'd found it, his mind racing. Charlotte, of all people, the sibling he had fought to forget, who had caused him so much pain in the past, was now entwined in his marriage. Victor's world tilted on its axis, but he kept his composure. He wouldn't confront Eleanor, not yet. Instead, he began to plot. If Charlotte wanted to destroy him, he wouldn't go down quietly. And if Eleanor thought she could betray him, she was gravely mistaken. The retreat ended with Victor wearing a mask of calm, his plans quietly forming. Eleanor, oblivious, believed her secret was safe. But Victor was no longer the loving, doting husband she thought he was. He was now something far more dangerous. A man scorned and determined to exact revenge. Victor returned from the retreat a changed man. To Eleanor, he seemed unusually composed, even affectionate. He surprised her with thoughtful gestures, flowers, her favorite meals, and an air of easygoing charm that had been missing for months. It put her at ease, and she convinced herself that Victor was none the wiser. But beneath his facade, Victor was carefully laying the groundwork for his revenge. His first step was to deepen the connection with Charlotte, not as an adversary but as an accomplice, or at least that's what he wanted her to believe. Victor reached out to Charlotte with a message. "We need to talk. Let's bury the hatchet." Charlotte, intrigued but wary, agreed to meet him at a neutral location. They sat across from each other in a dimly lit bar, the tension between them palpable. "You're not one for sudden reconciliations," Charlotte said, her tone laced with suspicion. "What's this really about?" Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've inserted yourself into my life again, Charlotte. If you're staying, we might as well make peace." Charlotte smirked. "Peace? Or is this your way of keeping an eye on me?" "Maybe both," Victor admitted, swirling his drink. "You've always been unpredictable. I want to know what your endgame is." Charlotte laughed, her eyes gleaming.
No endgame.
"Just living my life. If that happens to intersect with yours, so be it." Victor nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but he was far from convinced. He knew Charlotte too well to believe she acted without purpose. Her reappearance was no coincidence, and her affair with Eleanor was part of a larger scheme. Over the next few weeks, Victor played his part flawlessly. He met Charlotte occasionally under the guise of reconciliation, and even suggested that she come by the house more often. Eleanor, uneasy at first, eventually relented. Victor's calm demeanor reassured her, and Charlotte's charm made it easy to pretend nothing was amiss. But Victor was always watching. Every glance, every whispered word between Eleanor and Charlotte was noted, filed away in his mind. He began to manipulate the dynamics subtly, creating small rifts between them while making himself appear increasingly attentive and supportive to Eleanor. The first crack came during a dinner at the house. Victor subtly praised Eleanor's dedication to their marriage, emphasizing her loyalty and integrity. Charlotte's expression faltered for a moment, her eyes flickering to Eleanor, who looked uncomfortable under the weight of Victor's words. It was a small victory, but it fueled Victor's resolve. He had no intention of simply confronting them. That would be too easy, too clean. Instead, he would dismantle their bond piece by piece, exposing their betrayal in the most devastating way possible. Victor's game had begun, and neither Eleanor nor Charlotte realized they were already ensnared in his trap. Victor's meticulous plan unfolded gradually, each step carefully calculated to sow tension between Eleanor and Charlotte. His first move was subtle but effective. He began fostering moments of doubt, using his deep understanding of both women to manipulate their emotions. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Victor casually brought up Charlotte's past. "Do you remember when you disappeared to Berlin?" he asked her with a faint smile. "That was quite the scandal." Charlotte froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. "I wouldn't call it a scandal," she said cautiously. "Just a necessary escape." Victor chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Necessary? Running from someone's husband wasn't exactly subtle, was it? Eleanor's gaze darted between them, confusion etched on her face. "What are you talking about?" Charlotte shot Victor a sharp look, but he ignored it, his expression feigning innocence. "Oh, just an old story." Charlotte has a habit of getting involved in complicated situations. The tension in the room thickened as Charlotte's mask of confidence slipped. Eleanor's smile faltered, and a seed of unease took root. Victor noticed the shift and pressed on gently. "It's all in the past, of course," he added with a smile. "But some things never change, do they, Charlotte?" Charlotte's eyes narrowed, but she held her tongue. She knew Victor was toying with her, but calling him out would only draw more suspicion. Later that night, Eleanor couldn't shake the lingering discomfort. She turned to Charlotte in the kitchen while Victor worked in his study. "What was he talking about earlier?" she asked, her voice low. Charlotte shrugged, her tone dismissive. "Victor loves to dig up old dirt. It's nothing." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. "You seemed uneasy." Charlotte forced a laugh. "It's just Victor being Victor. Don't let him get into your head." Eleanor nodded, but her doubt lingered. Victor's words had struck a chord, and Charlotte's evasive response only deepened her unease. Victor, watching from the shadows, smirked to himself. The first cracks in their alliance were forming, and he intended to exploit them fully. The following week, Victor escalated his plan. He subtly altered his behavior toward Charlotte, alternating between warmth and veiled hostility. He invited her over for dinner again, but this time, he planted an anonymous note in her handbag while she wasn't looking. The note read, "You're not as clever as you think. Watch your back." When Charlotte found the note later that evening, her heart raced. She immediately suspected Victor, but she couldn't confront him without revealing her own secrets. The note's ambiguity also unsettled her. It could have come from someone else who had noticed her and Eleanor's connection. Charlotte began pulling back, growing more reserved around Eleanor, her usual confidence replaced by a sense of paranoia. Eleanor noticed the change and her own insecurities grew. What was Charlotte hiding? Why was she suddenly distant? Victor's trap was tightening. With every move, he was driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the final act of his revenge. Charlotte's paranoia began to spiral after discovering the anonymous note. She started avoiding Eleanor's calls and cutting their meetings short, afraid that someone, Victor perhaps, was watching. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. What had once been thrilling and passionate now felt strained, as though something dark loomed over them. One evening, Eleanor confronted Charlotte. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "You've been distant. Is it Victor? Did he say something to you?" Charlotte hesitated, her eyes darting around as though searching for an unseen threat. "No, it's nothing," she lied. "I'm just dealing with some personal things." Eleanor wasn't convinced. "You can talk to me. You know that, right?" Charlotte forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know," she said softly. "I just need some time." Meanwhile, Victor observed their crumbling connection with quiet satisfaction. He subtly fueled Eleanor's doubts by planting seeds of suspicion. He began making offhand comments that hinted at Charlotte's unreliability. "She has a way of disappearing when things get too real," he mentioned one morning over breakfast, his tone casual. "It's just who she is." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Victor shrugged. "She's always been like that. Charming, exciting, but when the stakes get high, she retreats. Just be careful." Eleanor didn't respond, but the unease in her chest grew. She hated that Victor's words seemed to align with Charlotte's recent behavior. Was he right? Was Charlotte pulling away because she couldn't handle the complications of their relationship? As the days passed, Eleanor's doubts turned into anxiety. She began texting Charlotte more frequently, trying to bridge the widening gap, but Charlotte's responses were curt and vague. The tension between them became unbearable, and Eleanor started questioning everything. Victor's next move was carefully orchestrated. He invited Charlotte over under the pretense of rekindling their sibling bond. When she arrived, he greeted her warmly, offering wine and a seat in the living room. "Eleanor's out tonight," he said casually, watching her reaction closely. "I thought we could talk." Charlotte sat stiffly, her eyes wary. "About what?" Victor leaned back, his expression calm but predatory. "About you and Eleanor." Charlotte froze, her glass of wine trembling in her hand. "What about us?" she asked cautiously. Victor's smile didn't falter. "I'm not blind, Charlotte, and I'm not angry. In fact, I find it fascinating." Charlotte's heart raced. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victor chuckled softly. "Don't insult my intelligence. You've been pulling her away from me, and now it seems she's starting to see through you. How long do you think you can keep this up before she realizes who you really are?" Charlotte's mask slipped for a moment, her fear shining through, but she quickly composed herself. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working." Victor's smile widened. "I don't need to scare you, Charlotte. I just need to let you unravel yourself." The conversation left Charlotte shaken, and when she left that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was 2 steps ahead of her. For the first time, she began to wonder if her affair with Eleanor had been a mistake. Eleanor, oblivious to the conversation, waited for Charlotte's usual goodnight text. When none came, her doubts consumed her. Was Charlotte losing interest? Or had Victor's influence begun to poison their connection? Victor, meanwhile, reveled in the chaos he had created. Eleanor's trust in Charlotte was crumbling, and Charlotte's confidence was eroding. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, the full weight of his revenge would come crashing down on them both. Victor's plan entered its next stage, shifting the battlefield into the public eye. At a gallery opening he hosted, he invited both Eleanor and Charlotte. Eleanor was hesitant. Charlotte hadn't been responsive to her texts, and the idea of seeing her in public with Victor present made her anxious. But Victor insisted. "I want us to look like a happy family," he said with a disarming smile. "Charlotte's trying Eleanor. Don't you think we should give her a chance?" Eleanor reluctantly agreed, unaware of Victor's true intentions. The gallery was buzzing with guests when Charlotte arrived. She looked stunning, her confident demeanor masking the turmoil beneath. Eleanor's breath hitched as she saw her, but Charlotte only offered a brief smile before turning her attention to Victor. The tension between them was palpable. Victor, ever the host, made a point to involve Charlotte in every conversation, subtly undermining her in front of Eleanor. He made comments that seemed innocuous to outsiders but carried sharp barbs meant for Charlotte alone. "Charlotte's always been a free spirit," he said to a group of art collectors. "She can't resist a challenge, even when it's not hers to take." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Eleanor, watching from a distance, felt a pang of confusion. Victor's words were layered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he was saying more than it seemed. The climax of the evening came when Victor led the crowd to the centerpiece of the exhibit, a new painting he had commissioned. As he unveiled it, gasps filled the room. The artwork was a stunning but provocative piece, a surreal depiction of betrayal. It featured a woman with Eleanor's unmistakable features, her face split between love and deception. Behind her, a shadowy figure loomed, bearing a striking resemblance to Charlotte. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. The murmurs around the room grew louder, and she felt eyes turning toward her and Charlotte. Charlotte stepped forward, her composure cracking. "What is this, Victor?" she demanded, her voice low but trembling. Victor's smile was calm, almost cruel. "Art imitates life, doesn't it?" he said softly, his gaze locking onto Charlotte's. Eleanor turned to Charlotte, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you know about this?" Charlotte's face paled. "Eleanor, I swear, I didn't." But the damage was done. The implication was clear, and Eleanor's mind spiraled with doubt. Victor had planted the idea in her head, and now, in front of a room full of people, he had solidified it. The rest of the evening was a blur. Eleanor avoided Charlotte, her emotions a storm of betrayal and confusion. Charlotte, humiliated and furious, left the gallery without a word. Victor, satisfied, watched as the rift between them grew. Eleanor sat alone in their car on the drive home, her thoughts racing. She couldn't deny the growing feeling that Charlotte had been keeping secrets from her. Meanwhile, Victor maintained his mask of concern, his satisfaction hidden beneath a veneer of loving support. "You looked upset," he said softly. "Is everything okay between you and Charlotte?" Eleanor didn't respond. The cracks in her relationship with Charlotte had widened, and Victor's trap was almost complete. Now, it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. Eleanor's mind raced in the days following the gallery incident. The painting haunted her, its raw implication of betrayal, the public humiliation, and Victor's calculated calm. She couldn't shake the suspicion that Victor knew something, but she also couldn't confront him without risking the truth coming to light. Instead, she turned her frustration toward Charlotte. Charlotte, on the other hand, was unraveling. Victor's move had shaken her confidence, and the anonymous note still loomed in her mind. She avoided Eleanor's calls, afraid of saying the wrong thing, and her withdrawal only deepened Eleanor's insecurities. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Eleanor confronted Charlotte at her apartment. She showed up unannounced, her emotions boiling over. "What is going on, Charlotte?" Eleanor demanded as Charlotte opened the door. "You've been avoiding me, and then that painting." Charlotte sighed heavily, running a hand through her hair. "I didn't know about the painting, Eleanor. You have to believe me." "But Victor knew," Eleanor pressed. "He's been saying things, hinting at things. Did you say something to him?" Charlotte hesitated, her silence speaking volumes. Eleanor's voice broke. Did you tell him about us?" "No," Charlotte said quickly, her voice firm. "I didn't tell him anything, but I think he knows." Eleanor stared at her, her heart sinking. "How? How could he know?" "I don't know," Charlotte snapped, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "He's always been manipulative, Eleanor. He probably guessed. Or maybe he's watching us. I don't know how his mind works." Eleanor stepped back, the walls closing in around her. "So you've been pulling away because you're scared. Is that it?" Charlotte's face softened. "I didn't mean to. This isn't what I planned, Eleanor. I didn't think it would get this complicated." Eleanor felt a mix of anger and despair. "Complicated? I trusted you, Charlotte. I chose you. And now you're telling me this was a mistake." Charlotte reached out to her, but Eleanor stepped back. "Eleanor, don't do this. Don't let him win." "Win?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "He already has. I don't even know who to trust anymore." She turned and left, slamming the door behind her. Charlotte stood frozen, her heart heavy with guilt and fear. Eleanor returned home to find Victor waiting for her. He was calm, his demeanor caring, as though nothing had happened. But his words were barbed with subtle accusations. "Rough day?" he asked, pouring her a glass of wine. Eleanor didn't respond, sitting down heavily on the couch. Victor joined her, placing the glass in her hand. "You know," he said quietly, "Charlotte has always had a way of pulling people into her chaos. It's not your fault." Eleanor's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "What are you saying, Victor?" He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Just that sometimes, people get caught up in things they don't fully understand." Eleanor stared at him, her mind spinning. He knew. He had to know. But how? And why was he playing this game? Victor stood, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You've been under a lot of stress." As he walked away, Eleanor felt the weight of her choices crushing her. She was trapped, and Victor held all the cards. But the worst was yet to come. Victor's endgame was approaching, and neither Eleanor nor Charlotte could stop what was coming. Victor's carefully orchestrated plan reached its climax during what Eleanor believed was a simple dinner party. He had invited a small group of close friends and colleagues, ostensibly to celebrate a successful gallery sale. Eleanor, still reeling from the tension with Charlotte, struggled to maintain her composure. She noticed how Victor seemed unusually cheerful, his eyes glinting with a secret he wasn't yet ready to share. Charlotte arrived late, her confidence a mask hiding the turmoil inside her. As she stepped into the dining room, she exchanged a fleeting glance with Eleanor, one of tension, regret, and unspoken words. Victor greeted Charlotte warmly, his charm on full display, as if nothing were amiss. The dinner proceeded smoothly at first, with laughter and flowing wine. Victor played the gracious host, engaging everyone with stories and jokes. But as dessert was served, his tone shifted. "I've been working on something very personal recently," Victor announced, his voice cutting through the conversation. "A piece inspired by trust, betrayal, and the fragile lines between love and destruction." Eleanor stiffened, her pulse quickening. Charlotte's expression darkened, and she set her glass down, her fingers trembling slightly. Victor gestured to a covered frame leaning against the wall. "I thought tonight would be the perfect time to unveil it. After all, art is best appreciated in the company of friends." Eleanor's stomach churned as Victor walked over and pulled away the cloth. The room fell silent. The painting was a masterpiece of cruelty. It depicted a woman who was unmistakably Eleanor, her features twisted in anguish, reaching toward another figure, Charlotte. The second figure held Eleanor's hand but gazed over her shoulder at a looming shadow that resembled Victor. The imagery was layered with symbolism. Love, betrayal, and manipulation intertwined in a way that left no doubt about the story it told. Eleanor's breath caught, her face paling. The guests murmured in confusion and discomfort, their gazes darting between her, Charlotte, and Victor. "What is this, Victor?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with shock and humiliation. Victor turned to her, his smile icy. "It's the truth, Eleanor. Isn't that what art is supposed to reveal?" Charlotte stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're out of your mind," she hissed, her voice low but furious. Victor's gaze shifted to her, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Am I? Or am I simply the only one willing to call things as they are?" Eleanor looked between them, her heart pounding. The weight of Victor's insinuations, the coldness of Charlotte's defiance. It all crashed down on her in an instant. The affair she thought was hidden was now laid bare, exposed for everyone to see. "You knew," Eleanor said to Victor, her voice breaking. "You've known this whole time." Victor nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Of course I knew, Eleanor. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't protect what's mine?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, her chest tight with shame and fury. "Protect? This isn't protection. It's destruction." Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Destruction is what happens when trust is shattered. You brought this on yourself." Charlotte grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Let's go," she said sharply. "You don't have to stay here and let him humiliate you." But Eleanor hesitated, her gaze locking with Victor's. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and despair. Victor smirked. "Oh, Eleanor, it's only just begun." As Eleanor and Charlotte left, the room remained silent, the stunned guests unsure of what they had just witnessed. Victor poured himself another glass of wine, his satisfaction palpable. He had exposed them, but his revenge was far from complete. He had more in store for the woman who betrayed him, and the sister who dared to return. Eleanor and Charlotte drove in silence, the weight of Victor's public humiliation pressing down on them like a storm cloud. Eleanor's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her mind a chaotic mix of anger, shame, and despair. Charlotte sat rigid in the passenger seat, her usual confidence shattered. "I warned you," Charlotte finally said, her voice low but trembling. "Victor doesn't play fair. He never has." Eleanor's grip tightened on the wheel. "And yet you dragged me into this?" she snapped, her words laced with bitterness. "Did you even care about what this would do to me? To us?" Charlotte flinched, guilt flashing across her face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't think he'd find out." Eleanor pulled the car to a sudden stop on the side of the road, turning to face Charlotte. "You didn't think? Or you didn't care?" Her voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You've ruined everything. My marriage, my life, everything." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. What could she say? The damage was done, and Victor's cruel masterpiece had turned them both into villains in the eyes of everyone who mattered. As Eleanor's sobs filled the car, Charlotte reached out hesitantly. "I care about you," she said softly. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You have to believe that." Eleanor shook her head, pulling away. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Meanwhile, back at the house, Victor surveyed the aftermath of his revelation with grim satisfaction. The dinner guests had awkwardly left, whispering among themselves about the scandal. Victor didn't care. He had planted the seeds of Eleanor and Charlotte's destruction, and now he would ensure they bore fruit. He poured himself another drink, his mind racing with plans. The painting had been the first blow, but it wasn't enough. He wanted them to feel the weight of their betrayal, not just emotionally but tangibly. He began making calls, setting the next phase of his revenge in motion. First, he contacted a journalist he knew, a gossip columnist who thrived on scandal. Victor fed them just enough details to pique their interest. A tale of infidelity, family betrayal, and the collapse of a seemingly perfect marriage. By the next morning, the story would be everywhere, leaving Eleanor and Charlotte with nowhere to hide. Next, Victor turned his attention to Eleanor's career. He knew her reputation as a respected psychologist was built on her expertise in relationships. What better way to destroy her than to expose her hypocrisy? He gathered evidence, text messages, emails, and other incriminating details, and prepared to leak them to her colleagues and clients. As Victor worked late into the night, he felt no remorse. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was justice. Eleanor and Charlotte had played their game, and now it was his turn. By the next morning, the fallout began. Eleanor woke to find her phone flooded with messages, some from friends expressing shock, others from colleagues distancing themselves. When she opened her social media, she was greeted with the headline, "Scandal Rocks Marriage of Renowned Psychologist." Her heart sank as she read the article, which detailed her affair with Charlotte in brutal detail. The painting was even described, its symbolism dissected for the world to see. Charlotte wasn't spared either. Her past scandals, which Victor had unearthed and leaked, were dredged up and woven into the narrative. Her reputation as a free spirit was now tarnished by accusations of manipulation and destruction. As Eleanor and Charlotte sat in the kitchen of Charlotte's apartment, staring at the article in silence, the gravity of their situation became clear. They had underestimated Victor, and now they were paying the price. "He won't stop," Eleanor whispered, her voice hollow. "He's going to destroy both of us." Charlotte's jaw clenched, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. "Then we don't let him. If he wants a war, we'll give him one." But Eleanor wasn't sure they could win. Victor had already torn their lives apart, and his revenge wasn't over yet. Charlotte's defiance lit a small fire in Eleanor, but it was dim against the overwhelming darkness Victor had cast over their lives. The article was just the beginning. Eleanor's clients began canceling appointments, her inbox flooded with messages questioning her credibility. Her career, her life's work, was crumbling before her eyes. Charlotte fared no better. Victor's planted stories about her reckless past and manipulative tendencies spread like wildfire. Doors she once walked through with ease now slammed shut. She was becoming a pariah in the same social circles she had once dominated. But Charlotte wasn't one to go down without a fight. "We're not victims, Eleanor," Charlotte said, pacing the apartment. "He wants us to break, to cower, but we're stronger than this." Eleanor looked up from her phone, her voice hollow. "Stronger? He's destroyed everything. My marriage, my career." Charlotte interrupted her. "Then we take control. He wants us to be weak. Let's show him we're not." Charlotte's plan was bold, teetering on reckless. She suggested turning Victor's weapon, his carefully curated image, against him. The same public spectacle he had orchestrated would now become his downfall. They began gathering evidence. Charlotte, who knew Victor's darker secrets, started compiling proof of his manipulations, shady business dealings, and even moments of infidelity from earlier in their marriage. Eleanor, hesitant at first, unearthed messages and recordings where Victor's controlling nature shone through. Together, they built a case that would expose Victor for who he truly was, a master manipulator hiding behind a polished veneer. Their final move was as theatrical as Victor's own. At an upcoming gallery event, they planned to confront him publicly, turning the spotlight back onto him. It was risky, but they had nothing left to lose. The gallery was packed the night of the event, buzzing with excitement for Victor's latest collection. Charlotte and Eleanor entered separately, blending into the crowd. Victor, ever the charming host, didn't notice them at first. He was basking in the glow of his success, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. When the moment came, Charlotte stepped onto the stage. The crowd fell silent, confused by the unexpected interruption. Eleanor stood near the back, her hands trembling as she watched. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charlotte began, her voice steady, "we've gathered here tonight to celebrate art, a reflection of truth. So let's talk about truth." Victor's smile froze, his eyes narrowing as he realized what was happening. Charlotte continued, her words sharp and deliberate. She began recounting Victor's manipulations, his schemes, and his calculated cruelty. She painted him not as the victim of betrayal but as the architect of destruction, using his art as a weapon to control and humiliate those around him. Eleanor stepped forward, adding her voice to Charlotte's. She spoke of their affair, not as an excuse, but as an admission of their humanity. She acknowledged her faults but turned the focus back to Victor's unrelenting desire for vengeance. The audience, captivated and uneasy, began murmuring. Victor's face darkened, his composure slipping for the first time. "You think you can destroy me with words?" he said, his voice low but venomous. "You've already lost." Charlotte smirked. "Maybe, but at least now everyone sees who you really are." Victor's attempts to regain control failed. The damage was done. Word spread quickly, the crowd buzzing with the revelations. By the end of the night, Victor's reputation was in tatters, his gallery's patrons questioning their loyalty to a man they no longer trusted. In the aftermath, Eleanor and Charlotte didn't emerge unscathed. Their affair remained a stain on their lives, but they found solace in each other. Their bond forged in the fire of Victor's wrath. They moved away, starting anew in a place where their past wouldn't follow them. Victor, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered empire. He had played his game too well, and in the end he had lost just as much as they had. The revenge he had sought so meticulously had consumed him, leaving him alone in the ruins of his own creation. And as Eleanor and Charlotte walked away from the wreckage, they vowed never to let anyone control their lives again.